Hi, welcome to Take from Caesar. My name is David Myrland. Nothing you'll hear me say is intended as legal advice. Anything that sounds like that to you, just consider it something somebody else might do on a planet far, far away where the law matters. It doesn't matter here. I prove it on a daily basis, believe it. About David Champion by yours truly. On the topic of the tax code, the Family Guardian had this to say: by far the most prolific source of research on this topic is David Myrland. And if you know Chris Hansen, I don't know him personally, but I know that he's into everything. He tracks what everybody teaches. And I don't know much more about him than that, but his websites are loaded with materials. And he was kind enough to take my argument and publish it without my name on it, about Section 83. I don't appreciate that at all. You can download this document at this web address right here. So you can print it out and study it on your own. This is going to be the video tutorial that will take you through my writings concerning a particular argument of David Champion's that dissuades me from purchasing anything else from him. I feel he's so far off track that I have to caution people to save their money. So, about David Champion, and I've got some writing here that I'm going to read, but I'll break into discussion when I feel like it. About David Champion. Since 1992, when I witnessed the IRS's penalization of Form 1040 NR filers across the country, I've ignored the anti-tax movement, the patriot movement, any movement by any name. I've also ignored the non-resident alien claim that citizens of the U.S. are just those in D.C. and the U.S. possessions. I'm going to begin this piece about David Champion with what a U.S. District Chief Judge provided against that claim in 1992. I added footnote 3, which is Lowell B. Craft's research on the cases involving the movement. Download the original of the Chief Judge's order to comply with a summons at this address, wevgov.com/summons.pdf. It's 45 pages, and in here I've taken 2 issues that he wrote against the non-resident alien sovereign state claim in a case that was filed to quash an IRS administrative summons. You'll see 3 briefed angles from which the non-resident alien claim is attacked and debunked. But I wrote the 3rd issue. I only took 2 from the judge. I wrote the 3rd one, okay? So, you get to see a federal judge's take on the claim as well as mine, and this is enough to keep me from ever saying the term non-resident alien in relation to any tax matters. The petitioner below had filed suit to quash an IRS summons. The only time I'd say I'm non-resident alien is when you leave the United States. I'm a non-resident alien to everywhere outside of the 50 states. Or I might have to say non-resident alien when I read 1402B, definition of citizen in Social Security Chapter 2, self-employed. The petitioner below had filed suit to quash an IRS summons. And I'll scroll through this and tell you when to pause it. Pause it if you want to read this. Pause. 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 I'm not going to pause through the footnotes. You can download the document and read it. pause, 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 and there's section 861, pause, 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 pause. So those are my feelings about the 861 claim. The proponents of that argument spend a lifetime in the regulations and an instant in the statute itself, and just presume that this is the way it is. When you read just the language of the statute itself, it destroys the claim that non-resident aliens don't owe a tax. David Champion published Shattering the Myths in 2010. $250 on Amazon. I didn't bother to check another site because I'd already been through this argument. But on Amazon, $250. My treatise, Take from Caesar, Volume 1, with a supplemental memorandum, Volume 2. Volume 1 is my treatise in the form of a criminal complaint for the violations of the law on the part of the IRS, which I discovered in 5.5 years of research beginning in 1988. Dave Champion's introduction to the movement was 1993, the year I completed my tax research, probably summer of 93. I got a YouTube comment about David Champion. I watched this video right here, and it looks like it'll take you to the web for that video if I click on this. I watched his interview about income tax, Shattering the Myths, stereo corrected, on his YouTube channel. Conspicuously, Dave doesn't claim to have been to court to see what the IRS and DOJ have to say about this claim, or any others really. He doesn't speak of litigation. Whereas I've been to court and been to court and been to court with my briefing, and I've seen them run a bunch of different directions, and I've briefed how all those directions are bogus and chewed them out about it in court to be as embarrassing as I can on paper and not have the document stricken. And now they just don't speak at all to rebut the claims and leave it up to the court. I've never taught that Tax Code Chapter 3 relates to anything because it's called non-resident aliens in foreign corporations. I've never visited that chapter. I've never relied upon it. It has nothing to do with my sphere of understanding. That amount of flat tax in Section 1441 in Chapter 3, it indicates that Chapter 3 is not talking about the graduated income tax at Section 1 with all of the brackets. Why would you go to Chapter 3 when it's not a tax that the IRS seeks to impose? Or seeks to collect, I mean. Why would you go to Chapter 3? It's a flat tax. Deduct 14% from the non-resident alien's pay. Oh, okay. So it is not the Chapter 1 tax. It's a tax that the IRS isn't even asking me for when I go out and get a job. They're asking me for Chapter 1, 21, and 23. If I'm self-employed, it's 1 and 2. Isn't that easy? Chapter 3 has nothing to do with anything. It appears from watching David Champion's video that Section 7701A.16's reference to Chapter 3 tax in its definition of withholding agent sidetracked Dave's understanding of the actual operation of the tax code and trapped him in Chapter 3. He presumes that everybody that withholds from a paycheck is a withholding agent, when in fact that term only applies to specific chapters and not chapters 1, 2, 21, or 23. And so he saw the word withholding agent and this restrictive definition that we'll get to, and presumed everybody that withholds is a withholding agent. You can't be. The withholding agent only applies to the 1400s. And that's nothing that the IRS asks of the American public. So I think that definition is what sidetracked him into the Chapter 3 and the whole withholding agent thing. Dave says that Chapters 1 and 2 are general provisions used to calculate income taxes when, in fact, Chapter 2 is Social Security. It's a specific tax, different from Chapter 1. They're chapters that impose taxes. They are not chapters that operate as general instruction, which is an entirely different tax than the one at Chapter 1, Section 1. This provision in Chapter 2 says to use Chapter 1 provisions to figure the Chapter 2 tax. So Chapter 2 isn't even about instruction. You go to Chapter 1 for the instruction for Chapter 2, and he has lumped them together. He doesn't recognize Social Security as a distinctly different tax from Chapter 1, apparently. The general rule for the purposes of ascertaining his net earnings from self-employment are to be determined by reference to the provisions of law and regulations applicable with respect to the taxes imposed by Sections 1 and 3 in Chapter 1. This indicates to me that Dave lacks any appreciable knowledge of Social Security or of how to calculate it. Dave's conclusion about Chapter 2 is a general chapter containing instructive provisions is plainly erroneous. David Champion's Tax Code Section 1441 claimed that wage withholding, the Form W-4, is governed by or is tied to Tax Code Chapter 3 is faulty for the following reasons. At 17 minutes into the video, Dave says that income taxes are only 3 chapters, and it's clear he thinks Chapter 3 is one of those. Americans are taxed under 4 chapters, Chapters 1, 2, 21, and 23. 23 is the matching FICA that employers have to pay. And there, W-4 and W-2 are from Chapter 24, the 5th chapter, which I don't have to go to because it's about how to collect income tax. We can't identify that there's a tax imposed on the value of labor. So I'm not going to go to Chapter 24 yet. From Chapter 24, which does not impose a tax, but rather just prescribes a method to withhold the Chapter 1 tax over the taxable year. You see that in Section 31A, which we'll see. By 18 minutes in, Dave is hopelessly locked up in Chapter 3 and begins to say that the liable one is one who is in receipt of property to be paid to a foreigner, citing a Venezuelan as an example. He'll go on to point at the definition of withholding agent referenced and quoted below. At 22 minutes, they get into wage withholding while keying upon the term U.S. person. I've never had to use that term. Number 2, Dave refers to Chapter 1 and 2 as rules for computation. This is true to a certain degree, but the Treasury wrote 1.1 and expressly named citizens of the United States as a subject of the provisions in Chapter 1. Until they wrote that regulation, it was a general chapter that you use to compute any income tax. Dave is correct from one angle. For Section 83 applies to all compensation and not only to compensation mentioned in Chapter 1. So any income tax imposed relative to compensation is subject to Chapter 1 provisions to calculate cost. But what he doesn't realize about the withholding agent definition is not everybody that withholds is a withholding agent under that term that we'll see the definition of here in just a minute. Employers are required to withhold. This does not require, right here, 3402, it doesn't require withholding agents to withhold. It requires employers to withhold. You don't have to be a withholding agent. You only have to be an employer to be required under the law, as the IRS portrays it, to be required to deduct and withhold. In general, except as otherwise provided in this section, every employer making a payment of wages shall deduct and withhold. How about that? And in Chapter 1, at the end of the year, in general, the amount withheld as a tax under Chapter 24 shall be allowed to the recipient of the income as a credit against the tax imposed by this subtitle. That's Subtitle A, Chapters 1 through 6. So we have everything we need to found in the law the IRS's platform for its demand that employers withhold, and it has nothing to do with the term withholding agent. And at the end of the year, this section, Section 31A, operates to give you credit for the amount withheld all year from your paycheck. And then you subtract that from this, and you either get a little bit back or you owe a little bit more. So I don't need Chapter 3 for any of this. And when we get to the definition, you're going to see it doesn't apply withholding agent to Chapter 1. But we're talking about the Chapter 1 graduated income tax. It doesn't even address itself to Chapter 1. So he's in a chapter, David Champion, he's in a chapter imposing a tax, a flat 14%, as we'll see, that isn't a reference to the chapters that the IRS operates on Americans. He's entirely off the rail, for starters. Here's the definition of withholding agent. The term withholding agent means any person required to deduct and withhold any tax under the provisions of 1441, 1442, 1443, and 1461. None of those are in Chapters 1, 2, 21, or 23. So the term withholding agent applies to chapters that aren't applied to Americans. But he went for it with the assumption, I feel, the assumption that withholding agent is anybody that withholds a tax. But it only applies to people that withhold these taxes. And so his entire framework is skewed. Here's 1441, 30% thereof for these. And here we have items of income for non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. That's the name of Chapter 2. Income items. Didn't say items of compensation. It didn't say items of, what I should say, income is profit. So this is a profit tax. It's a tax on income. So you still go to Section 83 to figure it out if it's compensation, if it's salaries or wages. The items of income referred to in subsection A, right above, shall be, let's see, where does it pick up again? The items of income referred to in subsection A from which tax shall be deducted and withheld at the rate of 14%. Well, that's not the graduated income tax, is it? Because there it depends on brackets. Here it depends on, take 14%. So it's not Section 1 they're talking about. If one asks Dave for an explanation of Section 83, he'll go blank, but he claims to have read the law. His lack of specificity about the different chapters of the IRS enforces is scary. and the fact that he cites only a couple of regulations tells me that he concluded his studies and wrote his book at a level approaching, at best, 10% of the research I did in my 5.5 years, June of '88 to December of '94. Let's see. That should be '93. Dave also claims to have read the works of others, but I've been writing about my analysis since 1993. It's a treatise called Codebreaker. He's never read anything I've written, or he'd know how to calculate cost as a member of the workforce. But when he goes to Chapter 3, he doesn't say anything about going to Chapter 1 to figure the tax. So he presumes that the law taxes the entire paycheck if you're liable. Well, no, it doesn't. You have to calculate your cost. In 5.5 years, I knocked it out of the park, and my findings stymie every government attorney who faces them in court, on paper, fully briefed. I know how the law operates in the IRS's favor, and I know what laws the IRS violates when operating. Dave probably did a lot of work and studied a great deal, but the majority of it was done in the wrong direction and on the wrong topics. Mr. David Champion was grossly hasty in his research, in his having written a book about tax law, and in his willingness to offer his conclusions as helpful in any way. I'm certainly not going to spend $250 just to obtain his book so I might review its contents, especially when he doesn't claim to have gone to court and when he's this mistaken on points I finalized in late 1993. To explain the tax code, one has to diagram the tax code, as you see me doing on the whiteboard in my tutorials. The way I argue the provisions I rely upon leaves the DOJ's top tax attorney unable to speak of them in defense of the IRS. wevgov.com/orth with a capital O. There's an April 2018 exchange of briefs with the government's top tax attorney, Richard E. Zuckerman. Dave's book is one of personal rabbit holes. That's what his book is. He went down certain rabbit holes and never made it out. Take from Caesar.us and click on YouTube for my videos. My video looks like here in the PDF document. Download the document. You can click right on that link and it'll take you to my videos. And here's my video about the Section 83 equation. Key to the code will explain Social Security first, which leaves just Chapter 1, and they wrote a regulation to drag you into that chapter. This one tells you how Section 83 operates. These are free videos. My book on Section 83 is only $425. It's $25, okay? My treatise, Take from Caesar Volume 1, it's $50. But you can spend $250 and get Dave's book. I was done in 1993, the year Dave began, and he wrote his book 17 years later after having missed all opportunity to view my work, but he claims to have read everybody else's stuff. When looking back, I see that I was trapped in the research and conclusions of others until summer of 1992, when I shut out the movement and decided to do my own work from scratch. Tax Code, page 1. It was then that I truly began to learn. I have Dave's answer to all the challenges I might confront him with regarding my briefed conclusions. It's the DOJ's reply from the spring of 2018 at this website. I have everybody's answer. The government's top attorney has answered my findings by running from them. Or is Dave going to claim to have a different way out of my briefing than the top tax attorney in the U.S. government? Dave would have to either claim to be the best tax attorney on the planet by presenting different conclusions that are in the DOJ's reply, or he has to utterly avoid my conclusions, as must the DOJ. As you watch those two videos, think of how I clearly observed and absorbed volumes of information, statutory and regulatory language in the chapters that impose the taxes the IRS takes, case law on statutory interpretation, and government briefings. I wrote 5 clients to the Supreme Court by October of '98 and 3 more in 2018. So I know everything the government attempts to use, and I know the faults in their diversions. I've briefed their faults. I've thrown this at the Fed's best many times, and now they simply clam up and hand it off to the judges. At the same time, the courts wield penalties for frivolity. My treatise and my 2006 criminal complaint to Congress has prevented no fewer than a dozen indictments for tax crimes. If my findings are outlandish theories, why do they shut down IRS criminal investigations and nullify grand juries? And when the hell does an attorney ever win a case by refusing to even discuss controlling provisions? You'll never win in court in a tax case if you argue inconvenient provisions, ones that protect liberty or property or affect the IRS. But when the mightiest legal department in the world walks away from somebody it sought to imprison, only a fool fails to take notice. Inasmuch as my materials about income taxes were available as early as summer of '93, you can't say the tax honesty movement has failed to study the law. It flat out refuses to study the law. Ignorance by choice. And then I get an email from somebody, another somebody, who's never seen my research, never watched my free tutorials on YouTube, recommending to me that I spend $250 for a rabbit hole born out of ignorance. Putting the movement behind me is likely one of the smartest things I've ever done. I teach a steady diet of statutes, regulations, and case law. I've found and briefed very specific issues and conclusions about specific taxes derived through strict adherence to statutory language, and what I teach isn't 1/100th of the research I did. It's just the top arguments. Consider these arguments. There's a neat punchline after this second one. FICA is imposed in Chapter 21 by Section 3101. It's taken out of paychecks. Tax Code Section 83 applies to any and all compensation, even wages in Chapter 21, because it's an income tax. Social Security is an income tax. What is it exactly that says wages subject to FICA tax and Section 83 in Chapter 1 aren't also allowed the Chapter 1 deductions in 63 and 151D? Chapter 1 provisions only seek to tax taxable income. It's not Chapter 1 taxable income until all allowable deductions have been taken. 63A defines taxable income, gross income minus deductions. But the FICA comes right off the top of every paycheck. Why don't I get these two deductions from the amounts taxable under FICA? On a Form 1040-EZ, there's a line that says if you're single and no one else can claim you as a deduction, enter, and then it gives you a dollar amount. When I started all this, it was $6,050, I think. And that was your 151D and 63C, personal exemption and standard deduction. But then you got Section 83 that explains how to tax. That's a Chapter 1 tie to FICA wages. How come if I include my whole paycheck in gross income by accident, in violation of Section 83, how come I don't also get the deductions in Chapter 1? If my FICA wages are 61A gross income, how come I don't get my personal exemption and standard deduction for taxable income under Chapter 21? They just run to Chapter 1, drop your paycheck in 61A, and go back to FICA and take the whole thing. I want those deductions. My wages aren't taxable yet. Chapter 1 taxes taxable income. And this second one is cute. So, you get levied out of your paycheck by the IRS. It happens all the time. You can't fill up the car, keep the lights on, feed the kids, etc. You need an abatement of the tax collection through levy. I need you to abate this levy. Who do I talk to? The IRS will put you on a payment plan if you file all back tax returns, and it will levy you again if you screw up the plan where you agreed to start making payments. You've received an abatement of Chapter 1 income taxes by filing an IRS Form 843. Just go to this IRS address. And if you're being liened and levied and you need some relief, you can file for an abatement of that levy action on your paycheck. You're a Chapter 1 taxpayer. They're collecting Chapter 1 taxes by levying your paycheck at your employer. You're Chapter 1. Subtitle A is Chapters 1 through 6. You filed a claim for abatement. The IRS has a branch set up to do it. The Problem Resolution Branch. And it's against the law. No claim for abatement of income, estate, and gift taxes. That's subtitles A and B right there, the whole thing. No claim for abatement. No claim for abatement shall be filed by a taxpayer in respect of any assessment of any tax imposed under subtitle A or B. And they've got an entire branch of the IRS set up to process claims for abatement for subtitle A, Chapter 1, taxpayers. Okay. That's a wheel that'll never get squeaky. Who's going to complain? Hey, they gave me relief I'm not entitled to. You'll never hear it. And so it just sits there in obscurity. And it prohibits an entire branch of the IRS. How, in 17 years of research, does one miss or otherwise fail to stumble across Section 83? For my purposes, Mr. Champion's book isn't worth the paper it's written on for the simple fact that his approach to the tax code is derelict. He's very likable, personable, articulate, and he clearly believes his conclusions to be accurate. Since my focus is on keeping Americans out of IRS and DOJ trouble, I have to offer my professional opinion. It's nothing personal. Had I heard Mr. Champion propose filing exotic tax returns to get money back from the IRS, I would get personal. America already has Pete Hendrickson screwing people into prison through his derelictions and inadequacies. My inexpensive products are on wevgov.com. This is a link to the interview where Lowell B. Craft says these things about me over the course of the interview. And here's the address, in case you encounter a link that doesn't work for some reason. 2 addresses on TalkShoe where you can hear recordings. I'm on 87488 every Wednesday night. And 59615 is my show, No Confidence. The second one here is American Liberties with Chris Chapman. And on mine, it's a lesson plan. They just wiped out the archive. It only goes back to 2015, but I used to have stuff going back to 2009, but those are all lessons in law. Property of American Liberties, LLC. I'm David Myrland. Yours truly. Be careful, everybody. Somebody might be a great guy, but they can be wrong. And their mistakes travel right into your affairs when you're not careful. Maybe only to the tune of $250 for one book that's mistaken. That might be the only damage you accrue, but you might end up in prison, like James Back, a Pete Hendrickson victim. And by the way, let's give you that. Let's give you that. How do I do this? Write this down. Get ready to write. wevgov.com/ all lowercase, no spaces, wevgov.com/ backtrialbrief.pdf, backtrialbrief.pdf. And there's the government's 2014 trial memorandum from Anchorage, Alaska, where they give you the definition of innocence, but it's a Pete Hendrickson victim that went to prison for 16 months, 6 counts of, fraudulent tax documents or failure to file. It was Pete Hendrickson tax returns. So be careful. That's the bottom line, and I'm not going to come down on David Champion. I'm going to come down on his book. So just be careful. Go ahead and watch the video of David Champion's that I reviewed here. And the bottom line, be careful. I've been paid bigger dividends from moving slowly than any other rule I follow. The first thing you do in court, you slow the proceedings down to a crawl, because the moment you don't, the court runs at the prosecutor's speed and your rights run right out the door. You slow everything down and examine your rights at every turn. And of course, learn your criminal code. I got dynamite materials on wevgov.com. Enough is enough. Thanks very much again for visiting Take from Caesar. My YouTube channel, wevgov.com, is dynamite. Takefromcaesar.us is kind of a next forward step. The judiciary stepped right in on the 7th Circuit in spring of 2018 to save the government's finest tax attorney, who couldn't even speak of controlling provisions in his reply, in the circuit court, and the Supreme Court let that stand. So the courts are every bit as much of the problem as the IRS is. With all that having been said, my name is David Myrland. Take care, be safe, and study the masters.